Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought that I would talk about this little video that I found very particularly interesting. And this video is going to be that of a Dante's Boxing Nation. And this video, all in all, is going to be talking about one of the new greatest talents out there in all of boxing right now. At least when we take a look at it on the surface, it looks like he is one of the greatest talents out there, and that is Mr. JARON Ennis, I believe a Philadelphia native. I've been hearing this kid's name overall through the grapevine now for several years, so it's very obvious that many boxers have really known about him for many, many years. And of course, when you take a look at the welterweight division, it still is as talented as ever. And the welterweight division, in my opinion, it's just a very interesting division. Not only is it extremely talented, but it's just one of those divisions that always seems to have a new boogeyman when it comes down to it. And when I say new boogeyman, I'm not necessarily always alleging that someone is being avoided, but what I am saying is that there always seems to be someone new within that weight division specifically to where they're the big new threat, even overall if there's great talents there. About 5 to 6 years ago, it was Keith Thurman, who was calling out Danny Swift Garcia, Sean Porter, and even at one point in time, Floyd Mayweather Jr. Then after Keith Thurman, it was Errol Spence Jr. After Errol Spence Jr., then it was a little bit of Terence Bud Crawford. And Terence Bud Crawford hasn't even secured his number one spot in the division yet. And Mr. JARON Ennis, he is now here, and basically he looks like he's going to be the next up-and-comer of the welterweight division. The big question is if JARON Ennis, if somehow he does get a big fight with that of a Terence Bud Crawford or that of an Errol Spence Jr., can he possibly actually get the victory against those opponents, or is he a little bit too green at this current moment in time? Anyways, Dante's Boxing Nation is going to talk about it. I'm going to tune in a little bit here and there. Let's get into it.
To decide. I'm going to make my statement in this boxing game in this welterweight division, and I will start this year.
Dante's Boxing Nation, what's going on, guys? It is unbelievable when you think of the talent pool that America has when it comes to black fighters in general. America has more talent in the sport of boxing than any other country in the world, and they don't even take advantage of it. I'm talking about old media. Do you guys know if JARON Ennis was from Kazakhstan, like Gennady Golovkin, if he was from the Philippines, like Manny Pacquiao, if he was from Mexico, like Canelo Alvarez, we already know what old media would be saying about him. We know how he would be promoted.
I somewhat agree with that when it comes down to it, but at the end of the day, what I will say is this. I don't necessarily have a problem with certain Latin or Caucasian or Asian fighters being promoted in a certain way, unless I think that it's completely out of proportion. Kind of like how people, they take a look at Naoya Inoue and they say all in all, oh, well, he's one of the top 5 pound-for-pound fighters. I don't know if I can really give him that, grade, because I just think that Naoya Inoue, even though he is a very special athlete and a very special fighter, he just has no legitimate A-grade wins on his record. It just is what it is. But when you take a look at other fighters like a Vasily Lomachenko and a Canelo Alvarez and other things like that, not only is it good to promote them, in a very, very great light, because of course you want, that different demographic to pay attention to the sport of boxing when it comes down to, you want to market it to them. But on top of that, fighters like that, like Vasily Lomachenko, even Gennady Golovkin to a degree, even though I wouldn't necessarily say that he has an A-plus resume, and of course, Vasily Lomachenko, Tyson Fury, and, what the hell is his name? Canelo Alvarez. All those guys you can tell are real deal fighters, or were once upon a time. Like, for example, Gennady Golovkin, I don't think he's really at the best point in his career right now, but he was a real deal fighter. But Mr. JARON Ennis, of course, he is extreming a great amount of hype, not only from boxing, and from a certain amount of the other media outlets, but of course from these new media channels. And I get it to a certain degree. But the only thing I would say about JARON Ennis is that I cannot have him on my top 10 pound-for-pound list. To be quite honest with you, I don't even know if I can have him within my top 30. And a certain amount of people would say, wow, that's a little bit, ridiculous. Why would you say that? When you talk about in terms of talent and in terms of skill set, he looks like he has the skills to pay the bills, no doubt about it. But like I said, I can't put you on my top 10 pound-for-pound list just based off of how I think you look against B and C grade fighters. I mean, JARON Ennis, it's no offense against him, but the man has not even won a title yet in his career. At least when Vasily Lomachenko and Gennady Golovkin and some of those other fighters were being very highly praised on the pound-for-pound list, at least they had already won a multitude of titles. So I'll overall give, them a little bit of the benefit of the doubt. Now, once again, was there certain media outlets that were, rating them out of proportion? Yes. But a certain amount of these channels are rating Jaron Boots Ennis out of proportion right now. Don't get me wrong. I don't think that he's just some hype job. He looks very, very talented. He has very decent strength. He has very decent speed. I like his feet. I like his head movement. The only thing I would say about Jaron Boots Ennis is that sometimes he needs to be a little bit more defensively responsible, but he seems like he has a very decent chin as well. So Jaron Boots Ennis, he can give anyone out there a very rough time, in my opinion. But like I said, we need to slow the roll a little bit when we talk about him debatably being a top 10 pound-for-pound fighter. The top 10 pound-for-pound award, in my opinion, or being on that list, is a very prestigious award. And in my opinion, unless you have proven yourself overall to beat top contender after top contender, or a top contender that at one point in time was within that top 20 pound per pound or close to it, you can't be on my list. So Jaron Boots Ennis, very, very talented. But for the people I don't know that rank Jaron Boots Ennis on the top 10 pound per pound, I get it. But at the end of the day, like I said, that's just not logical. It is what it is. Like I said, let's just slow our roll here a little bit. I get it. But at the end of the day, like I said, I'm going to need to see him in the bigger fights and at least win a title.
Gennady Golovkin.
I mean, imagine trying to put someone on the pound for pound list and the man hasn't even won a title yet. These are the same guys that try to claim that Gennady Golovkin and Vasily Lomachenko, they were so hyped up. Jaron Boots Ennis has not even won a title in his career. And people are legitimately trying to put him on the top 10 pound per pound list. Like, come on.
Way before he fought Canelo Alvarez, when he was fighting fighters like Willie Monroe, when he was fighting fighters like Marco Antonio Rubio, they were already praising him as if he had beat Floyd Mayweather, Canelo Alvarez, and Andre Ward.
Well, there's some people, once again, like I said, you can argue that they put him out of proportion. But when you took a look at a prime Gennady Golovkin, it was very clear that Gennady Golovkin was on another level. And one thing I'll say about Gennady Golovkin is that he was repeatedly facing top 10 guys in that division, and he literally was rolling them over. I mean, he literally was like a steamroller in that division. Now, do I believe that a lot of those guys are A-grade fighters? Do I believe that Marco Antonio Rubio, Matthew Macklin, and, Prozga, and, a certain amount of those fighters, do I believe that, Daniel Gill, do I think that any of those guys are really first ballot Hall of Famers? No, I don't. But at the end of the day, you can tell that Gennady Golovkin was a real deal fighter. So this narrative that Dante always tries to promote about Gennady Triple G Golovkin, about him being this complete hype job, that's completely false. Because Gennady, during his prime, not only was he a steamroller in that division, he completely steamrolled over the IBF champion David Lemieux, who at the time was very, very decent. I wouldn't rank him as an A-grade fighter, but he was a decent B-grade fighter when it comes down to it. And then he fought Danny Jacobs, who is going to be a first ballot Hall of Famer in my opinion. He's a multiple-time champion, I believe. If I'm wrong about that, someone correct me. And he was able to beat Danny Jacobs in a very close fight. And then on top of that, he gave Canelo Alvarez hell in both of those fights. So Gennady Golovkin, like I said, he, in my opinion, when people ask the question, well, Canelo, who has he beat that's really an all-time great fighter? First of all, I don't really think that that's a great question because you can use that little game with a multitude of fighters. If we really wanted to tear down Andre Ward, let's take a look at his resume. I can sit here and say, oh, well, how many all-time great fighters, like within the top 50 of all time, has he really beat? Because really, if we're just going to go there, that one that Canelo Alvarez has over Gennady Triple G Golovkin, I think that Gennady Triple G Golovkin during his peak is greater than any of the fighters that Andre Ward beat. Now, some people overall, they may say, oh, well, that's just ridiculous. Is it really? Was Chad Dawson during his peak ever on the same level as a Gennady Triple G Golovkin? Was Carl Frosch someone who, was very, very open, could get hit very often, somewhat one-dimensional in his fighting style, had a great right hand and a great chin, but if you got past that, you were usually able to outbox him, at least if you fought a really, really elite opponent. It just is what it is. Is Mikhail Kessler someone that is on the same level as Gennady Triple G Golovkin? Is Sergey Kovalev even at his best on the same level as Gennady Triple G Golovkin? I don't think so. I don't even think Sergey Kovalev at his highest level, overall is on the same level as, Gennady Triple G Golovkin. But that doesn't mean that Andre Ward is not an all-time great fighter. That doesn't mean that I'm going to take a look at his resume and just trash it completely and say, oh man, how many all-time great fighters did he beat? There's a difference if you're talking about someone like a Mikey Garcia maybe, when you take a look at some of the champions that he beat and someone who was able to beat somewhat of a talented division and beat the best of his day. And that's what Andre Ward was able to do. It's also what Canelo Alvarez has somewhat been able to do. But of course, he has a certain amount more contenders to face because Andre Ward retired early. Canelo Alvarez has not done that. So we'll see what happens.
A Fighters like JARON ENNIS is not even really talked about that much when it comes to old media. It's obviously because
he's talked about a certain amount of the time by Showtime, but if you're talking about ESPN and old media like that, no, of course they're not going to talk about him because they don't like Al Heyman and they don't like the PBC. And I'm not saying that ESPN and Top Rank that they're completely great company when it comes down to it, but he could be talking about some other things as well, like Ring Magazine. Actually, Jaron Boots Ennis, I've heard his name plenty of times by a certain amount of media circles. But when it comes down to, will he be as hyped up as some of his other fighters? Maybe not. But I can understand overall why maybe they hype up those fighters a little bit more. But, that really isn't a huge problem to me when it comes down to, I mean, once again, I can just compare it like this. You think overall that a bunch of the black demographic, you think that they were watching golf before Tiger Woods? Probably not. Do you think that overall there's a certain amount of the black demographic that is probably interested in Patrick Mahomes and, the rise overall that he has had in NFL football? Do you think overall that there's a little bit more hype behind him because of that? Yeah, probably. It just is what it is, especially in the sport to where usually, for that position, black quarterbacks are not usually the most dominant. It just is what it is. That's not me saying that they can't be dominant, but when you take a look at the top 10 quarterbacks of all time, they're usually that of Caucasians. It just is what it is. Or if you want to take a look at another sport, when it comes down to it, if you want to take a look at tennis, maybe some would argue that Arthur Ashe is there, but I don't know if I would debate him in my top 10 of all time. Let's say overall that there was a black player all in all, and now of course I can mention Serena Williams, but I'm more talking about the men's circuit. Let's say that there was a black tennis player overall on the move. There would be a lot of people hyping them up. It just is what it is. Now, is there such a thing, of course, as certain people tearing black athletes down, especially in that of boxing, because black athletes can tend to be the most dominant boxers in the sport? Absolutely, no doubt about it. But like I said, Gennady Triple G Golovkin and some of these other fighters, they were real deal fighters. Now, if you're talking about someone like a Tommy Morrison, for example, or a Jerry Cooney, those were great white hypes, in my opinion.
on a coincidental.
And even Tommy Morrison, I believe at one time, was at least able to win a heavyweight title. So I'll at least give him a little bit of credit. But Jerry Cooney, for example, Jerry Cooney was pretty much complete hype.
List, but one of the best things about being on the coincidental list is as long as you keep winning, you cannot be denied. There's been so many times where old media has promoted a certain fighter as pound for pound the best fighter in the world, like a Chocolatito Gonzalez, for example, who came up around the same time that Terence Crawford came up. You fast forward to present day, and we see where Terence Crawford is, and we see where Roman Gonzalez is. Terence Crawford is still undefeated, and he's pound for pound the best fighter in the world today.
No, he's not pound for pound the best fighter in the world today, and some would debate that, but in my opinion, you just can't be on that level. I mean, when the biggest win of your career is over Sean Porter, that's already had 3 losses, and at the time didn't have the belt. It just is what it is.
With that,
I mean, that basically would have been calling Prince Nassim Hamed, the number 1 pound for pound fighter, because he would have beat Marco Antonio Barrera, during that fight. It just is what it is.
being sick.
And of course, for those of you that don't know, Nassim Hamed got his ass whooped in that fight, but it is what it is. Anyway.
So first, the boogeyman in the welterweight division was Errol Spence. Then it became Terence Crawford. Now the new generation boogeyman is JARON ENNIS. You guys just heard in that clip right there, JARON, he did an interview with Fight Hype. You guys could watch the whole interview there. And JARON ENNIS, he basically said in a nutshell that he's coming for all of their belts. He's going to unify, or he wants to become the undisputed champion, and he said he should have one of their belts by the end of this year. He said by October.
It would be very interesting to see what happens. Personally, if Errol Spence Jr. and Terence Bud Crawford, if they have a fight, which I'm hoping happens at the end of 2022, but who the hell knows with those 2 different promotions? I have no idea. And now, more than likely, hopefully, Terence Crawford is no longer with Top Rank, but you never know when it comes down to it. So we'll see what happens. Do I believe that Jaron Boots Ennis is going to get a fight with either of them? I doubt it, but we'll see what happens.
So heard him.
And that's not me necessarily saying that they're scared, but what I will say is this, not only do they possibly have bigger fights to worry about, but Jaron Boots Ennis, I mean, why would you really decide to face him, especially if you possibly want to face a Terence Bud Crawford or Errol Spence Jr. next? At least that is worth your time and it's going to be worth the money. Jaron Boots Ennis, when it comes down to it, he's a very dangerous fighter right now. So if you don't have to face him, I don't think a certain amount of those fighters will face him.
Explain, he was trying to say it in a nice, respectful way, but he was basically saying, there's a reason why these guys won't fight me. They know what it is. Let me start by saying this. To me, there is no doubt in my mind that JARON ENNIS is the future of the welterweight division, and I'm talking about the very, very near future.
I would agree. I think within the next 2 years, Jaron Boots Ennis more than likely is going to be atop of that welterweight division. It could be Virgil Ortiz. Virgil Ortiz is somewhat similarly talented to that of a Jaron Boots Ennis. I would say that Jaron Boots Ennis has more of the athletic advantage. In terms of skill set, they both look extremely highly skilled.
I don't believe that Terence Crawford or Errol Spence, they're going to fight him. I believe they're going to move up to 154. And no matter what they're talking about.
Well, Dante, with this bullshit narrative that you've been spreading about Canelo Alvarez, wouldn't that mean that Terence Bud Crawford and Errol Spence Jr., even if they did face each other, it's all about consistency, right? So that means that they'd be ducking Jaron Boots Ennis? Because really, to be quite honest with you, Jaron Boots Ennis, when I just take a look at his talent level, he's more talented than that of a Jamel Charlo. It just is what it is. Jamel Charlo is a person that already has a loss, and really, to be honest with you, he really should have 2 losses because that last Brian Castano fight, I mean, he got very, very lucky that it was a draw.
When it comes to splits and what PBC just recently said about how the money is not.
But you notice once again, like I said, heavy is the head that wears the crown. Mr. Saul Canelo Alvarez, he has to do things, he's always compared on a whole nother level compared to everybody else. So if Terence Crawford, even if he beats Errol Spence Jr., what is it going to be after that? Oh, well, he can go up and face Jamel Charlo. Even though Jamel Charlo, I don't think that he would beat either Errol Spence Jr. or Terence Bud Crawford. He's just too limited. But if it were Canelo Alvarez, no matter what fight he takes next, there's always some sort of excuse. Or there's always this, or there's always that. It's just always something. Once again, that's how you know you're on the, the next level. That's how you know when you're on top.
I don't think any of that stuff is going to matter. That fight is going to happen. It's inevitable because of the simple fact that they're both going to move up to 154. And if they both want the fight, none of that is going to matter what PBC is saying, what people are talking about when it comes to splits. None of that will matter if both of them want to fight against each other, which leaves the welterweight division all to JARON ENNIS. Now, even though it would be huge for JARON ENNIS to, of course...
What I'll say is this, Jaron Boots Ennis, he does have to be careful against that one young one, Virgil Ortiz. Virgil Ortiz, he's very talented. Every time I've seen Virgil Ortiz, I always thought that he was the real deal. Excellent A-grade power when it comes down to it. Very good defense, very, very good accuracy. Like I said, he almost kind of reminds me of a bigger version and stronger version of Mikey Garcia. I'm not sure if I would quite compare him necessarily 100% to the complete skill set of Mikey Garcia, but that's what he kind of reminds me of. Really likes to keep his hands up, works off of counters, most of the time a pressure fighter. He's a very interesting fighter to watch.
Put Errol Spence or Terence Crawford on his resume, but the good news for JARON ENNIS is he can create his own legacy without those guys by once again taking over a division that will...
So how come the winner of Terence Bud Crawford versus Errol Spence Jr. doesn't have to go after Jaron Boots Ennis? Because we all know that if this was Saul Canelo Alvarez or someone else, you'd be basically bitching and moaning that, they're avoiding someone. But like I said, we all know what Dante's about.
Always be one of the deepest divisions in the sport of boxing. 147 historically has always been one of the toughest divisions to conquer. I mean, if you're a dictator and you're trying to conquer the world, it's easy to take over little small countries that have small, weak armies, right? But try to go conquer China.
And that basically was a shot at Canelo Alvarez. And if I had to guess, more than likely he's going to mention Canelo Alvarez's name. Canelo unified a very decently talented weight division at 168. Would I say that it was necessarily on the same level as welterweight? No. But it still overall was a very, very decent weight where, if you're talking about, say, Josh Taylor, for example, it was like, say, Canelo. When he unified the division, I would say that it was A grade. I'm not going to put it on the A plus level necessarily, but if you want to put it on the A grade, you could. But that's the problem. Unless he unifies light heavyweight, there's no weight divisions around there, in my opinion, that would be ranked as A+. I don't even think that if he unified over Demetrius Boo Boo Andrade and Jamal Charlo, I don't even think I would rank that as A+. And the reason why that is because I just don't think Charlo and Demetrius Andrade, I'm not saying they don't have a chance, but they don't have a 50-50 chance. Josh Taylor, when he unified the 140-pound division, you could put it on an A level just because he defeated Regis Prograis, Victor Postal, and Jose Ramirez, and on top of that, that one Davey O'Hare's or whatever the hell his name was, that one undefeated British fighter. He defeated some very decent prospects, so maybe you can put that on the A level. Alexander Usyk, maybe about an A minus when it comes down to it. When he unified cruiserweight, Terence Bud Crawford, his probably was like a B plus, maybe A minus, maybe. Now some people may say, well, why do you say that that's B plus? Because when Terence Crawford unified 140, I'd probably give it a B plus, to be quite honest with you. Victor Postal was, I would say, an A minus fighter at most. Of course, he was coming off of a very decent win over Lucas Matisse, but I wouldn't rank Lucas Matisse any higher than an A minus fighter. I mean, how many big victories in Lucas Matisse's career does he really have? I mean, he has that great win over, Lamont Peterson, but he's also a guy that got outboxed by Danny Garcia, and Danny Garcia is an A minus fighter as well. So it just is what it is. But the other two fighters that he fought, I mean, don't get me wrong, I love Terence Crawford. Love me some Terence Crawford. But that division that he unified was the weakest unification that I've personally ever seen. It just is what it is. I would have to take a look at other unifications that have happened in history, like a Kostya Azur or Bernard Hopkins. I would have to really take a look at that. But at least Bernard Hopkins, for example, like he beat Felix Tito Trinidad, who was one of the top pound-for-pound fighters at the time. Terence Bud Crawford literally defeated Victor Postal, which is a decent win, but I wouldn't say, Victor Postal, in my opinion, I wouldn't say that he's a first ballot Hall of Famer. And then you had Thomas Delorme and Joey Sandango. Like, I mean, come on, man. Those fighters are weak sauce.
Or Russia, or America. Now you got a real battle on your hands. And that is what the welterweight division is.
And if you're comparing it by countries, Terence Bud Crawford, he he didn't even take over a place like Germany and Great Britain. Like, he literally took over, like, Lithuania, like, at that 140-pound division. At least when he unified 168, you can argue that he took over, like, Great Britain or Germany or something like that. Now the toughest unification lately, what would I say? You could argue that is Canelo. Maybe Josh Taylor as well. One of those two. But, in my opinion, those two, when it comes down to it, they would have the toughest of unifications, at least as of recent. I don't know if I would put Alexander Usyk's unification quite on the level of theirs, just because Alexander Usyk was very decently favored in every matchup that he was in. So, But of course, that doesn't always mean that your division is not talented. Maybe you just may be on another level. But when I take a look at Alexander Usyk's division, I would say that it was A grade, but A minus.
Regardless of what happens in the Errol Spence versus Dennis Ugas fight, you still have Dennis Ugas as a possible opponent, because I don't believe Dennis is planning on moving up to 154. You got Virgil Ortiz. You got Conor Benn. And then one of the biggest fights, I truly believe, for JARON ENNIS in the near future would be him versus Josh Taylor. Pound for pound, one of the best fighters, top 5. Pound for pound, one of the best fighters in the world.
No, Josh Taylor, in my opinion, cannot be top 5 pound for pound. Don't get me wrong, very great fighter. But when I take a look at Josh Taylor, does anyone really think that Josh Taylor is going to beat any of the top tier welterweights? I mean, I even have my doubts that Josh Taylor would defeat Danny Garcia or Sean Porter. I'm not even 100% sure if he would beat them. It's like, no offense against Josh Taylor, highly skilled, but there's a reason why they're highly promoting him as top 5 pound for pound, and they never wanted Golovkin or Lomachenko or Fury to be on that level. We all know why that is. Because once again, they want a Crawford or Spence or one of their fighters to defeat Josh Taylor, because they know more than likely that Taylor's going to get pieced up against one of those fighters. And then they'll say, wow, he beat someone on the top 5 pound for pound. He has to be number 1 pound for pound. Now, don't get me wrong. Beating Josh Taylor, of course, means that you got a great pound for pound win. But to me, that's like a big win overall if it were like a Vasily Lomachenko or Gervonta Tank Davis beating him. Because Josh Taylor, I'm sorry, when I take a look at Josh Taylor, does anyone truly think that he's going to have a chance against Terence Crawford or Errol Spence Jr.? I mean, would he even beat Virgil Ortiz? I'm not so sure.
And a real undisputed champion at 140. A year from now, Josh Taylor will most likely be fighting at the welterweight division and will already have a couple of fights there.
Yes, and he'll probably get his ass whooped as soon as he has a legitimate A-grade fight there. Like I said, no offense against Josh Taylor, and if the dude proves me wrong, he proves me wrong. But I don't see him beating any of the elite guys. I mean, he barely got past Regis Prograis, and I don't even know if Regis Prograis, for example, is like on the Sean Porter level. It's like you barely got past him when it came down to it. I don't see him beating any of the super duper talented welterweights. I don't know if he gets past. I certainly don't think he gets past either Terence Crawford or Errol Spence Jr. I don't even know if he'd get past a Danny Garcia or Sean Porter. I don't think he'd even get past a Keith Thurman. I'm not even sure if he'd get past a Yordenis Ugas, to be quite honest with you. I don't know if he'd get past Virgil Ortiz. I'm not sure if he'd get past any of those fighters. I don't know if I would favor him in any of those fights. No offense against the dude. Dude can fight, but
I mean, for me personally, yeah, it would be great if we got to see JARON ENNIS versus all of these guys. But at the end of the day, especially when it comes to JARON ENNIS, Errol Spence, and Terence Crawford.
Hey, it's me, your dry skin. I know I can be challenging.
All three of these fighters are on the coincidental list. All three of these fighters will always be rooted against when it comes to the many racist boxing fans that exist in the sport of boxing in America today. So I personally prefer that JARON ENNIS is fighting against other fighters that are waving flags from...
Of course, and that's Dante's way of basically saying that, I'm not going to criticize Terence Bud Crawford or Errol Spence Jr. if they don't face JARON Boots Ennis. That's basically his excuse. So that's his jail-free card for criticizing Canelo Alvarez and basically saying that, well, you should be facing different demographics when it comes down to it. And, that's why black fighters, they shouldn't be facing against black fighters. What a bullshit excuse.
Other countries like Mexico and Conor Benn from the UK.
So then next, if Errol Spence Jr., if he don't face Terence Bud Crawford, shit, it should be okay, Dante, because he should be facing people of different demographics and waving different flags. Take a look at Virgil Ortiz and like that's so stupid.
And so on and so forth. And I believe Errol Spence and Terence Crawford, they feel the same way when it comes to JARON ENNIS. He's the new generation. Let him create his own legacy by beating the fighters that old media in America is most likely going to promote over JARON ENNIS as the next big star.
The only one that I can really see is Virgil Ortiz. That's a very decent fight, though.
In that division. Like I said, this is what old media did with Teofimo Lopez. They promoted him as this big future pound-for-pound #1 king. They did it with Roman Gonzalez. They did it with...
Right, but Teofimo was not a complete hype job. Now, he did lose his last fight to George Kambosos. But when you do defeat a very great talent like a Vasily Lomachenko, you do deserve a great amount of respect. But, this is why when it comes to Dante, you have to be very careful of what he says. Because if you just run in here when it comes down to it and you take a look at it and you're like, oh, yeah, I totally agree. And if if you don't know that much about boxing and if you don't pay attention to the fights and, what really happens, you're going to fall right into this same, pro-black cult overall that many people overall have fallen into. It just is what it is. You're going to fall into that same hole. And it may not be everyone's fault because, like I said, Dante, he's been around the sport for years, but every narrative or a lot of the narratives that he puts out there, he's full of hot air. But it is what it is.
Canelo, they did it with Golovkin. They did it.
See, he said that they're doing it with Canelo. Dude, Canelo is the rightful #1 pound-for-pound fighter. Like I said, you can't have the resume that Canelo Alvarez has and just be this complete hype job. Like, come on, man.
With Kovalev and the list.
Now, if you want to make the case with Naoya Inoue and Roman Chocolatito Gonzalez, like, that makes sense. But if you're going to talk shit about Tyson Fury and, Golovkin and Lomachenko and, Canelo Alvarez, dude, all those guys at least have some decent wins in their career. Like, this was the same guy back when the Gilmore Rigondeaux versus Vasily Lomachenko fight happened. This was the same dude, all in all, that thought that Gilmore Rigondeaux had a legitimate chance over Vasily Lomachenko. And then Vasily Lomachenko whooped that dude's ass. And then all of a sudden, what did they say? They just make excuses. And, these are the same guys that call Vasily Lomachenko or Gennady Golovkin a hype job. Well, it's Deontay Wilder or Gilmore Rigondeaux a hype job? Now, of course, it works both ways. There's a certain amount of quote-unquote old media, as they would call them, that call a certain amount of black fighters hype jobs. And like I said, not every fighter that just has one loss or even a couple losses in their career is just a complete hype job. A hype job, in my opinion, is a fighter that, they had, #1 pound-for-pound claim, but they've almost lost every single one of their big fights. And I'm not talking about, in the sense of like a Sugar Shane Mosley or like a Miguel Cotto, certain fighters to where, yeah, they lost multiple fights in their careers, but usually if you were not the creme de la creme or debatably the #1 pound-for-pound fighter, you usually were not going to beat them, or they would not lose unless it was to a very talented fighter. I'm talking about fighters like Adrian Broner. Those are fighters that I'm talking about. Or if I was going to bring up another one, I don't really want to say Mikey Garcia because Mikey was a very talented fighter. But even at this point, maybe if you want to say Mikey Garcia, because he got upset in his last fight, and then there might be a couple of other ones that I'm not personally thinking about. Really, if we even want to go there, and some people may think that this is a little bit too far, but someone like a Mike Tyson, maybe even a Prince Nassim Hamed.
Goes on and on and on. So once again, I say, if old media, if that's who they're going to be rooting for in all these decals, then those are the fighters that fighters like JARON Ennis, Terence Crawford, and Errol Spence should be going after first.
I understand your point, Dante, but I also understand why you're putting that out there. Because this is basically an excuse. Basically, what is Dante saying in this video? He's basically saying all in all that, I'm always going to criticize someone like Canelo because he doesn't face, the quote-unquote slick black fighters. But if one of the fighters that I like do it overall, it's okay if they don't face them because all in all, they should be facing, the fighters overall with a different type of fan bases. Like, come on, dude. Like, once again, I can see right through this bullshit, but it is what it is. Anyway.
But when the smoke clears and there's no one else to face because they beat everyone, that's when they should be fighting against.
You can't always get big fights when you beat everyone. There's certain fighters out there that allegedly won big time opportunities like a Jamal Charlo, but they're not willing to take on a David Benavidez. They're not willing to take on a Demetrius Boo Andrade. And to be quite honest with you, I really haven't heard any criticism out of your mouth for Jamal Charlo.
Each other. That's how we got those super fights like Leonard versus Hearns and Ali versus Frazier. They were the two best fighters in their division, so it obviously made all the sense in the world.
Yes, but they didn't always just clear the streets. Sometimes when it comes down to it, two top contenders, they're just meant for each other, and that's the best fight to make. So it just is what it is.
Make that fight. But
he's also going to make that same argument with Gervonta Tank Davis, and I can already tell because Gervonta Tank Davis, once again, he's a very big asset for them as well.
Things are really interesting right now for JARON Ennis.
But the fighters that you see overall, they promote, now at the current moment in time, Errol Spence Jr. and Terence Bud Crawford, the main three fighters that you're going to see them promote all in all that are futurists, all in all, or that, are looked at as the future, Jaron Boots Ennis, Shakur Stevenson, and Gervonta Tank Davis. They have to protect those fighters.
Because he's not ranked number one in any of the organizations in the welterweight division.
And that's not me saying that those fighters are not real deal fighters. When I take a look at all of them, they look like real deal fighters. But what does that mean? What am I saying? Basically, if they do a similar move to another fighter that they don't like, they're not going to criticize them the same way.
I believe the highest he ranks is like number 3. This is another reason why I believe by the time he becomes a mandatory in any of these organizations, there's a good chance that at least both or one, Errol Spence and Terence Crawford, will be moving up to 154. But I will say this, I believe if anyone is going to fight JARON Ennis, I'm talking about out of the other welterweight champions right now, I truly believe that it would be Terence Crawford. And it's because Terence Crawford has a history of going after the most dangerous fighters.
Does he really? How many of them has he fought? Like I said, he fought Sean Porter, but both of those fighters pretty much had to be trapped into a corner. It just is what it is. I mean, apparently Terence Crawford could potentially face a Keith Thurman next, but I haven't heard Terence Bud Crawford mention Jaron Boots Ennis' name at all.
Errol Spence was the...
That's not me necessarily saying that Terence Bud Crawford is afraid. I don't want to go around spreading that narrative. But like I said, Dante, it's going to be very interesting to see what you have to say. I already know what he's going to say because, once again, Dante already gives you hints. He basically just gave you a huge hint if you were paying attention enough, and if overall you can see right through him when it comes down to it. Basically, what he told you is that if Terence Bud Crawford don't face Jaron Boots Ennis, he's basically going to say, oh, well, that's not that, that fight doesn't really need to happen right now, when it comes down to, the fight that does need to happen is Virgil Ortiz, versus. So basically what he's going to do is he's going to deflect it on someone else. That's what he's going to do.
True boogeyman at 147. Nobody wanted to fight Errol Spence. Terence Crawford was the only fighter that was mentioning Errol Spence's name.
Now, once again, certain people may ask, well, they criticized Sean Porter and Keith Thurman in the past, And those guys are black fighters, so how can you explain that? Once again, easy, because those guys, all in all, they were not looked at as the future best of their divisions. When you talk about fighters that are looked at as debatably in that top 5 pound for pound range, or that could be later on down the line, that's when all of a sudden they protect them, even if they're in the same division and they look like one or the other is not wanting to fight each other. So Terence Bud Crawford, Errol Spence Jr., they have to be somewhat highly protected, but more likely Terence Bud Crawford right now, because it looks like he's going to have the edge over Errol Spence Jr. Javante Tank Davidson, Shakur Stevenson, those are guys all in all that are very highly protected right now. Devin Haney is decently protected right now as well, but not even he is going to be as highly protected as those two.
He was the only one pulling up on Errol Spence. Nobody did that to Errol Spence. At least until Errol Spence, he started to become a name at 147 to where a lot of the PBC fighters, they had no choice but to fight him because it made too much sense financially, even if you were to lose to him. Matter of fact, Sean Porter is a perfect example of the point I just made because he made an interesting admission after he lost to Terence Crawford. He actually admitted that he was planning on the Errol Spence fight being his last fight. He was planning on retiring after that fight. So it kind of sounds like the Errol Spence fight to him was somewhat of a cash out type of fight. This is a dangerous fight. I may or may not win it. So let me just go in here, make as much money as I can. If I lose, especially if I get beat the hell up, I'll just go ahead and retire.
I somewhat agree with that. That's why everyone wants that Saul Canelo Alvarez fight. Because people take a look at him and they don't mind losing to Canelo Alvarez. But losing to Jamal Charlo or Demetrius Andrade or Caleb Plant or another one of these fighters that are around here or David Benavidez, that's not anywhere near. You're not going to get anywhere near the paycheck. You're also not going to get anywhere near the recognition whether you win or lose against those guys. So why the hell fight one of those guys when you can get the lottery ticket over Saul Canelo Alvarez? That's why Jamal Charlo, for example, like he ain't facing anyone. He's not facing David Benavidez. He's not facing, Demetrius Boo Andrade. He ain't facing any of those guys. He's like, you crazy? I'm still waiting for that Canelo Alvarez lottery ticket.
But Sean Porter did so well in that fight, that's what gave him confidence to continue fighting. And once again, these are Sean Porter's own words. His own words were, he was planning on retiring after the Errol Spence fight. And this is the reason why Sean Porter retired after the Terence Crawford fight, because that fight did play out the way he was hoping the Errol Spence fight wouldn't play out. So with that being said, I doubt it if all three of these guys end up facing each other, but I think there's a very, very good chance that at least two of them will face each other. And I believe it's going to end up being Spence versus Crawford because that's the biggest fight in boxing. That's the fight that we've been talking about for the last 2 or 3 years. There's no doubt about it. That fight would make far more sense being first than them once again fighting again.
When it comes to the Errol Spence versus Terence Bud Crawford fight, I really hope that fight is even competitive. And some people may take a look at me and they say, what the hell are you talking about? Of course that fight is going to be competitive. It's two of the best fighters in the world. Just because you have 2 top 5 pound for pound fighters doesn't mean that it's going to be overtly competitive. I think that both fighters are going to be the greatest fighters that they've ever been in the ring with. But when I just take a look at Terence Bud Crawford, I just think that he's a level above Errol Spence Jr. And some people may disagree with me there, but when I take a look at his footwork, I think he has better footwork. I think that he has better footwork and faster feet than Errol Spence Jr. He clearly has better hand speed. And really, when you talk about the power, I think Errol Spence Jr., of course, he may be a little bit bigger than Terence. But even if you don't want to overall say, it's because of the size advantage, I think that Errol Spence, at his best, he naturally is a better power puncher than Terence Bud Crawford. But the only thing that worried about me about Terence Bud Crawford facing up against Errol Spence Jr. in the past was, first of all, will he be able to handle a punch if Errol Spence Jr. hits him right? And in the Sean Porter fight, now Sean doesn't have the same level of power as what an Errol Spence Jr. does. And of course, we've seen Terence Bud Crawford get hurt a multitude of times in his career. But Terence, at least officially, has never really been knocked down. Now, I thought that he got knocked down against Aegis Velasquez. But at the end of the day, he was able to get back up, even if you want to call that a knockdown, and he was able to knock the dude out, who at least is a decent fighter. I want to call him an A-grade fighter, but he's a very solid contender. And I don't even know if I call him a B-grade fighter, but he's powerful, and he's got some skills. So Terence Bud Crawford, I think not only is he more maneuverable than Spence, I just think that he beats Spence. And to be quite honest with you, If Spence does not come in there fully motivated, and if he comes in there with some of the drinking problems that I have heard of, and on top of that, some of these injuries, Errol Spence will be lucky in that fight if he don't get stopped. So we'll see what happens. But, I could be getting ahead of myself. We'll see.
The next generation fighter. That would be like Floyd Mayweather not fighting Manny Pacquiao and instead fighting Keith Thurman. So in a perfect boxing world, we'd get to see all three of these guys clash.
Well, according to you, overall, Keith Thurman, he should be counted as the better fighter because we all know that the quote-unquote black fighters, that they're always just slick, and when it comes down to, they're always above any other contenders. That's basically always the Dante's Boxing Nation's mindset. Now, don't get me wrong. Are the majority of black fighters in boxing a huge threat because of their style and because they tend to be a bit slicker and more defensively responsible, and all in all, they're just, harder to hit? At times, definitely. More, most definitely, as Deontay Wilder would say. But like I said, that doesn't mean that every single one of them overall is going to do that. Like I said, take a look at Keith Thurman, for example. If we were going to compare him versus Manny Pacquiao, Pacquiao, of course, is a Philippine fighter, and Keith Thurman is from the U.S., all right? But does that mean that Keith Thurman is the all-around greater fighter than Manny Pacquiao? No, of course not.
But I'll settle for Spence versus Crawford, or even Terence Crawford moving up to 154 if he can't get the Spence fight and fighting the winner of Charlo versus Castaño. 154.
Well, all in all, that would mean that he's clearly ducking Errol Spence Jr. All in all, if he backs out of that fight, right, Dante? Because once again, that's the same energy that you would have with Mr. Saul Canelo Alvarez. So we'll see what you say, but I already know what you're going to say.
It's going to be
the only way overall that it'll be acceptable for Terence Bud Crawford not to get that fight, or whatever the hell it is. Like I said, Terence Bud Crawford, he better not go in there and just basically say, oh, well, it's not 50-50, so I ain't taking it. Because if he does that bullshit, that'll tell me all in all that he don't want that fight. All right? And it's no offense against Terence Crawford. I don't want to, allege anything. I don't want to say that he's scared. But he's been talking that way for a decently long time. He's like, oh, well, I don't even want that fight if it's 50-50. And I get it to a degree. Everyone wants to feel respected. But listen, dude, you got to be realistic. You're not the bigger draw than Errol Spence Jr. And on top of that, Errol Spence Jr., more than likely after his next fight, is going to have 3 out of the main 4 belts. So it's like, come on, man. You're not getting the 50-50 split.
Actually, it already is. It's just as stacked as the 147-pound division is. Because at 154, of course, you got Charlo.
No, it's not, dude. Just stop. You hear this, dude? But once again, there's a reason why overall he hypes up that division. Because he knows that if Terence Bud Crawford or Errol Spence Jr. go up there, he can basically say, wow, can you believe that? Did you see the way that Terence Bud Crawford and Errol Spence Jr. defeated that division? And he's, he beat him out. No one at 154. I don't even know if there's anyone there overall that's as big of a threat overall as like a Virgil Ortiz. I mean, it just is when you just talk about all-around skill. Now, of course, I would put Jamel Charlo on, the higher pound-per-pound list, ranking than a Virgil Ortiz or some of the guys. But when you just talk about any of those guys, when you take a look at Jamel Charlo, he is not the most skilled fighter. Don't get me wrong, he's not like a C-grade fighter, but in my opinion, he's not an A-plus skilled fighter. He's very vulnerable to anyone overall who is going to be near his own same size with, and Terence Bud Crawford and Errol Spence are, when it comes down to it. They should be able to win that fight because they're only outweighed by, a weight class. And when it comes down to a Jamel Charlo, what I'll say is this. I don't even think Jamel Charlo, now in terms, once again, for pound-per-pound status, he has to be ahead of these fighters. But let me just state this personally, and some people may disagree. I think the last couple of fights that Canelo Alvarez has had against Billy Joe Saunders and Caleb Plant, I think that those fighters, for those weight divisions, to be honest with you, just in terms of skills, I think all in all that they're more talented than what a Jamel Charlo is. If Jamel Charlo were in that division, I don't think that he would have beat either of them. I don't even know if Jamel Charlo would have beat either of those fighters.
You got Castaño.
I mean, take a look at Jamel Charlo versus Matt Korobov, for Christ's sake.
You got Lara. And then you have Tim Tszyu, Costa Tszyu's son.
Oh yeah, Tim Tszyu Tszyu's a world beater. Like, come on, man. Are you kidding me? Look at how he tries to, put certain weight divisions up there that don't belong there whatsoever. Come on, let's really take a look at that division in a realistic light. You have Erickson Lubin, who's already suffered a loss there, and in my opinion doesn't really look all that impressive. Lara's not even there anymore, and even if he is, he's like 37 years old when it comes down to it. I mean, who else you have there? Julian J. Williams, who's looked just spectacular lately, coming off of a couple losses when it comes down to it. The only two there that are really worth a damn or Jamel Charlo and Brian Castano. So it's like, come on, man, just stop.
Who's a new mandatory at 154. There's going to be a lot of fireworks once again, probably next year, starting the end of this year. I'll close out with saying this. Obviously, there's no guarantees. Anything can happen in the sport of boxing, but there's a very, very good chance that JARON Ennis, he can end up conquering the 147-pound division within the next.
In my opinion, it's either going to be him or Virgil Ortiz. I would say that JARON Boots Ennis, he has a slight edge over Virgil Ortiz, in my opinion. But don't underestimate Virgil Ortiz. That kid is very, very talented.
Next year, like he's projecting, he will definitely become the mandatory within a year for some of these belts. That's when it's going to get really interesting. I think I said it already. Virgil Ortiz is already the number one contender for the WBO belt. If I'm not mistaken, I believe he's number one for Errol Spence's belt as well. And if the Crawford-Spence fight is not going to happen next, Spence and Crawford, they should both be going after Virgil Ortiz because that...
No, actually, they should be going after JARON Boots Ennis because JARON Boots Ennis is the biggest threat. Is that not correct? Once again, do you notice what Dante's vaccination is doing here? Do you notice what he's doing here? Once again, he's setting up excuses and basically saying that, because people will ask him, he knows this. Like I said, Dante, he's not as stupid overall as he tries to play off. He just acts dumb when it comes down to it. But like I said, because people will ask him and they'll basically say, oh, well, why does Canelo Alvarez overall have to face these alleged slick black fighters? But oh, no, this doesn't happen. Oh, well, because those guys are different demographics, blah, blah, blah. Bullshit. All right. At the end of the day, if you have a big fight in front of you, and if you don't have a lot of other great options, you should take that fight no matter what demographic you are. But we all know why Dante's vaccination, we all know why he's pushing that out there. So that is his already built-in excuse. Like I said, if you take a look at Dante's vaccinations videos, you can tell what he's going to say several months later on down the line.
Is a huge fight. It's a huge fight because once again, it's the biggest rivalry in the sport of boxing. Black versus Mexican. People never want to admit this, but if you don't believe me, all you have to do...
Well, according to you, Dante, when it comes down to it, black fighters, at least at the current moment in time, are so far ahead of everybody else when it comes down to it. And in terms of, all-time great boxers, yes, about, I don't know what percentage I would give it, but I would say, at least when we talk about the top 20, I mean, yeah, a good 70% of them, at least overall, would be like in my top 20 pound per pound of all time. Maybe even top 30, no doubt about it. But at the current moment in time, if you're going to spread this narrative that, black fighters are usually the most talented, especially from the U.S., then why doesn't Terence Crawford or Errol Spence, why not go after JARON Boots Ennis? Why go after Virgil Ortiz? Because we all know that, if George Kambosos went after Ryan Garcia next, because all in all, he should be going after different demographics. And on top of that, when it comes down to, it's worth a lot of money, you'd get on his ass.
Just read the comments on the internet whenever there's a conversation about a black fighter and a Mexican fighter. On top of that, we all know Mexican fighters, they have a huge Mexican fan base. So any one of those guys, Errol Spence or Terence Crawford, they should both be going after Virgil Ortiz if they're not going to fight against each other next. With that being said,
in my opinion, Terence Bud Crawford, the best fights for him next, the Virgil Ortiz fight would not be bad. JARON Boots Ennis would not be bad, but I just think all in all, and this is talking about, of course, if he can possibly get the Errol Spence Jr. fight, I think the best next move for him would be either a Keith Thurman or that of a Virgil Ortiz. Those are, in my opinion, the two best fights for him. Now, for an Errol Spence Jr., in my opinion, what are the best fights for him? A JARON Boots Ennis fight, in my opinion, would be a very, very great fight, but I just don't see that happening. And on top of that, if you can't get the Terence Bud Crawford fight, Errol Spence Jr. has already talked about a multitude of times going up to the 154-pound division. He'll probably just go up there and try to fight Jamel Charlo, or whoever is the winner of that Brian Castano versus Jamel Charlo rematch.
I'm going to wrap this video up. That's all I got for now, guys. I'm on to the next one. All right, now check this out.
But anyways, that's really about it for today. I just thought that I would talk about that because I found that particularly interesting, and you can already tell what excuses Dante is already trying to build in. So it's just very particularly interesting. But anyways, that's really about it for today. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later.